Smith-Morra Defense arises after the Sicilian Defense, d4, and now this is the Smith-Morra. It's a very aggressive, tactical, and dynamic opening. It leads to open positions. You have the bishop pair usually, sacrifice pawns, basically a pawn because you're playing a gambit. There are various pawn structures. It's not very theoretical, but theory is critical. You go for kingside castling and for a kingside attack, but you also play on the c-file and the queen side, so you basically play on all parts of the board. It's a very risky opening because you are sacrificing a pawn. So the piece setup for white, as you can see here, this bishop goes to e3, f4, or g5. It has many places. The knight always comes to f3. The bishop almost always comes to c4, and the rooks go on c1 and d1, and the queen usually to e2. For black, this almost all possible piece setups are played. Knight c6 usually, sometimes very rarely knight d7, d6 pawn, and e6, e5 are also all possibilities. a6, b5 is a possibility to develop the light square bishop to b7, and sometimes the bishop after d6 can be played to d7. This dark square bishop usually comes to e7 after e6 or e5, but sometimes it goes after g6 to g7, and this knight usually comes to f6, but sometimes also to e7, and the queen sometimes to c7, sometimes to a5, sometimes to b6. The rooks usually on c8, d8, or e8. So this is the summary of the lines we'll be covering today. Yes, there are a lot, but we will cover them as well as we can. And the declined versions of the Smith-Morra are far less, because I included a lot of sidelines in a single chapter, the declined sidelines chapter. Mostly because some of these sidelines are frankly ridiculous. So the Chicago defense aims to develop the rook on a8 and put it on d7, where it will line up with this white queen on d1. So again, let's take a look. e6, knight f3, a6, now b5, attacking this light square bishop, d6, preparing the maneuver to d7, and now this maneuver is played. Bishop e3 entices this maneuver, but it's also a developing move. So against this, white simply plays knight d4 and goes for f4, f5, because now this rook on d7 blocks the c8 bishop from protecting e6, so we make use of that. Also note the sideline with d6 immediately, and now knight c6 is inserted, so we get the same position but with knight d6. Here we play rook fd1, and there are a lot of complications here, usually sacrifices on b5, knight a4 is sometimes a possibility. For more, check out the longer video on this opening. So now we go for the Taylor defense. So the Smith-Morra accepted, and d6 is played, a6, and a6 prevents bishop b5 and knight b5, which are relevant after e5. Now after knight f6, e5 really isn't possible, and now bishop f4 is the main line. Other moves are also possible, but bishop f4 is the main line recommended by Esserman. So bishop g4, h3, aiming to play against this bishop. If it retreats, now Esserman's recommendation is queen b3, which is a very brilliant move indeed. It attacks f7. It allows these rooks to go to c1 and d1. It attacks b7. It vacates stuff like queen a4 check, knight a4, knight b6 ideas. It vacates the d1 square for this rook, so it's a very nice move. I should note that after bishop takes f3, after h3, instead bishop takes f3, queen takes f3. This is a position with a bishop pair for white, but black does have an extra pawn. After e6 trying to develop, so now e6 must be played to develop this bishop. Fianchettoing would waste too much time and be liable to tactics, so e6 needs to be played. And now this d6 pawn becomes a target after rook fd1, queen a5, and bishop b3. Bishop e2, bishop f1 are also possibilities. So now we go for the dragon formation, e4, c5, d4, c takes d4. They accepted. And now g6 defines the dragon formation. Bishop c4 and bishop g7. Now the pawn sacrifice line is played. It's a recommendation by Esserman. Of course, this pawn cannot be taken. Well, it can be taken, but it leads to this position. Note that king f6 runs into knight e4 check, followed by checkmate soon enough. So he must, black must give up the piece. And now, yes, white is down a pawn, but he has good he or she has good chances to attack on the dark squares. Note after e5 that the pawn cannot, usually isn't accepted. Knight h6 is a better try, and after castles, note that we can't take on e5 because the h6 knight would be hanging. So castles, bishop f4 and d6. Bishop f4 aims to take on d6 and not allow the queen to recapture, because then the bishop would recapture. So after e takes d6, black is forced to take back with e pawn, and this e pawn becomes a weakness and a target for white. White enjoys an edge because of this misplaced h6 knight and the target on h6, on d6. So for the queenside fianchetto formation, just as we saw the kingside fianchetto, there's the queenside fianchetto. This is the defining move. And here white simply castles, and after this he plays knight d5. He or she plays knight d5. He or she is able to do that because black is very underdeveloped on the king side. His king is still in the center, his or her. I should use they. Their king is still in the center, so that creates a problem for black. So knight d5 is possible, and the sacrifice works because of the following tactics. Now here black is basically busted after this line. I should note here that knight c6 is possible with the queenside fianchetto, the insertion, and here this line keeping the bishop pair is possible, and also after b5 bishop b7, bishop b3 bishop b7, we have a4 b4, and now still knight d5 because these pieces are undeveloped. So this tactic works out. For example, this with rook e1 and a lot of devastation to follow on the e file. The Larsson defense, it's a very simple defense to counteract for white. It goes like this: e6, e6 now queen c7, aiming to create a battery with bishop d6. But after rook e1 lining up for knight d5, there is bishop d6, bishop e3, and now this variation. Note that the queen can't capture here because of knight d5 with knight b6 or even knight c7 check ideas. So this variation here, now the queen must move. It tries to trade itself, but the bishop is captured, and now takes here followed by queen takes d7 check is devastating. I should note that the best variation against this is knight g7, after rook c1, castles, bishop b3. Again, knight d5 is possible, making use of this queen on c7. This is another line. The Siberian Trap setup arises after the following moves. Now queen c7, note that a6 isn't played as in the Larsson defense. So castles, and now knight f6, aiming to go for the knight for the Siberian Trap with knight g4 and knight d4, dislodging the knight and checkmating on h2. So knight b5 is played to annoy the black queen. Queen b8, it retreats, and after e5 a pawn sacrifice, knight g4, bishop f4. This position is slightly better for white because of the strong pawn on d6. Note that after knight takes e5, takes, and rook e1, black is in has a lot of problems to solve. After queen b8 there's queen d4, preparing bishop f4 with a lot of devastation to follow, and after queen c5 there's simply bishop c1, bishop f1, preparing bishop e3, rook c1, knight c7 check ideas. Also note that after bishop c4, knight f6, there's queen e2, and now the same thing with e5 and overprotecting e5, aiming to go for knight b5, knight d6 check ideas. So the Scheveningen-Svechnikov formation is the following. So black simply tries to develop his pieces as such, and now e5 is played, preventing white from playing e5. So if black were to castle, white would play e5. So black plays e5 themselves, and after bishop e3, castles, rook c1, bishop e6, and b4. This position is slightly better for white because yes, he's down a pawn, they're down a pawn, but this pawn is very weak, and white has a lot of play. And also note this bishop isn't so great either. So this is one example line. Note that there's another setup here with a6, rook d1, and now bishop f4, aiming to attack this black queen, rook c1, and an eventual b3, bishop b3, aiming for knight d5 ideas, which we have seen. Esserman created this name, the professional's choice. It arises from the following moves, and now after bishop g5, this move annoys this knight because it wants to go to g6. So black is forced to make a concession, either f6 or h6, which would weaken their king to be able to dislodge this bishop at g5. So f6 is played, bishop e3, b5, and this position is again slightly better for white. And after bishop g5, h6, still bishop e3 is the best move according to Asselman and to my own analysis. After knight g6, bishop b3, and rook c1 ideas, queen e2, rook e1, rook d1. There are a lot of ideas here, knight d4, f4 later, f5, and white seems to be getting the better of this. So the early bishop d7 lines, they arise after the following. So basically it's the Svechnikov-Scheveningen structure, but with bishop d7 inserted. This move does block the rook attacking the d8 queen, but it also weakens the d6 pawn, so this is immediately exploited with b4, bishop f4, and white again enjoys a small edge in this position. Also note here that there are other early bishop d7 lines, like in this line. Here you simply castle, there are no early tricks, but after queen e2 and e5 kind of ideas, if g6 here is played, usually it's better also to play bishop f4 immediately, and now e5. So remember bishop f4 against early bishop d7. And now we move on to the declined variations of the Morra. The Scandinavian is the most common declined variation, takes, and now we take, aiming for knight c3, knight f3. We can see this here, and now actually the tactics, as you can see here, work out for white. Here f3 is played if the king is on d8, and if the king here is on d7, d5 is played. So here we can see that f3 is played. Note that e6 immediately here, this is another declined variation, would be met by d5, going for a good Benoni, and d6 is simply met with d takes e5. It's a good version of a Sicilian line. There's queen a5, check, and knight c3, and this is good for white. After c3 there's also g6, and now we still try to go for a dragon formation, but if black refuses to take the pawn on c3, we now finally have to take it, and if he refuses to take it with e6, he or she, then we take it like this. There's also after c3 queen a5, and now bishop d2 is simply very strong, aiming to recapture here with a strong center. After e5, this critically weakens the f7 square because e6 is no longer possible, so bishop c4, knight f3, knight g4 are good ideas, as we can see here. And after d6 and c takes d4, we finally recaptured the gambited. Black doesn't want to recapture the gambited pawn, so we take it ourselves, and here we get a good center and a nice grip on the center. The Alpen formation arises after knight f6 here. Black again doesn't want to take the pawn, but now white enjoys a nice position in the Alpen where he or she can attack on the h7 square. And this position, rook d1, bishop d3, bishop b1, queen e4, attacking on h7, these kinds of ideas are very strong. And finally, the push variation of the Smith-Morra. So the push variation here occurs, and now simply d3. This is a relatively weak variation because it allows setting up the Marocci bind or Marocci bind. And this kind of setup here is the Marocci bind, and now queen e2, rook d1, rook c1, b3, bishop b1. Let me say them by their proper order. First you play queen e2, then rook c1, then you tuck away the bishop on b1, then you put the rook on d1. You try to play knight d4, aiming for f4 or knight d5, and white enjoys a very good position. And that's it for the lines. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about pawn structures in the Smith-Morra. There are a lot of them, and each requires a specific type of concrete play. But the Schev-Svech formation lends its way to strategic thinking, so we can talk about it. As in the normal Svechnikov, there's a hole on d5. It's a dynamic position. White enjoys a better pawn structure, but black has the more dynamic chances and the easier breaks. So as in the normal Svechnikov, white's plan is to control d5 and attack d6, but unlike the normal Svechnikov, there's an open c file because white sacrificed the pawn there. So white can control that usually with rook ac1. And black's plans include the d5 break and controlling c4. So the positional themes, there's a hole on d5, white must control it with pieces, in general a knight on d5. Black controls more central space, so white needs to watch out for that, and also make sure that to know that e takes d5 for white is generally a very bad idea, because it stops the the d6 pawn from being a weakness, and it also denies the white pieces the d5 square. And d4 is a chronic weakness for white. Be careful of the d4 square lest a black knight lands on it, and an eternal black knight annoys you on that square. Actually, the d4 square is called the Achilles heel of the Smith-Morra by Mark Asserman. So if it's one thing to remember about the opening, it's to attack, because if you don't, you're just down a pawn. And with that, thank you for watching.